Hello everyone, Mr. Renfro here with the confirmation lesson for Sunday, the 6th of December. This is the third and final lesson in our series on other faiths, and this will be the last lesson for the fall semester. So let me just take a brief minute at the beginning of class and talk a little bit about what we've done this semester and what we're going to do over the next few weeks as we roll into the holiday season. So the fall confirmation semester has had a total of 8 lessons that I have taped for you guys. Okay, there were 5 on the first unit on discipleship, and then there were 3 in this unit on other faiths. And then that is going to be it for the fall semester. As we roll into Christmas and New Year's, there will not be Sunday school classes over those times. And then I think in the spring, Pastor Sean and I have talked about what we want to do with confirmation. And I think we're just going to give it a rest for a little while until we can gather in person. The next series of lessons is called Tough Questions. And the lessons are exactly that. They are a series of discussion questions about issues in our faith and issues in our Christian life and sort of how we deal with them as Lutherans, and they just don't lend themselves to making videos. It doesn't do any good for me to sort of talk into the camera about some of these questions when I can't have a conversation with you and we can talk about the questions and what the answers might be. And this is just not a great format for that. So I think we're going to give the videos a rest. And probably we won't do much of anything for confirmation in the early weeks of next semester, January, February, moving into March. And then as we get to a point where we can meet together again, whether that's outside by the fire pit, in an outdoors setting with our masks on, or, when you guys start going back to school and we can go indoors, then I'll do some catch-up lessons and I'll get us to where we need to be before summer starts. So that's kind of the plan for confirmation moving forward. So what I would ask all of you to do is, if you haven't watched all 8 films from the fall semester, I would ask you over the course of the next couple of months to please do that. Okay, so we've got plenty of time for everybody to go back through the material that we've done since we started in September, and everybody can be caught up once we're able to meet together again and keep moving forward. I would really prefer to not have to go back over this material because we have plenty of other stuff that we need to talk about before the summer, and I'm going to be racing to try to catch up. So I need everybody to do their part, please, and have watched these films, and I would appreciate that. Okay, for today's lesson, I have 2 things that I want to do in today's lesson. The first is that traditionally, during one of these first lessons in December, I spend some time talking about Advent. You guys know I always tell you that one of my jobs is to sort of teach you what is going on in church and in the church calendar and some of the different things that you see in church services. And so I want to spend some time talking about that today. And then when I'm done doing that, then we will do the third and final lesson for the Other Faiths unit. Okay, so Advent. Advent is a word that means, coming or arrival. We talk about the advent of something. Jeffrey, I'm taping a lesson. What do you need? It is 2:10. Go away. Sorry, everybody. Okay, can you close my door, please? Jeffrey, close the door. Thank you.
When will you be done?
I will be done as soon as you let me finish taping the lesson. All right. Advent, arrival, or, sort of waiting on something. And so this is the period of time that we are focused on the arrival of Christ in the world at Christmas. Now, you guys know, and I've talked about this before in class, the 7th graders have heard this, maybe not the 6th graders, but just to reiterate, Christmas is not actually when Christ was born, right? We don't know when Jesus was born, but what we're fairly certain of is that it wasn't in the middle of winter, right? So it probably, Jesus was probably born during a time when they would have had better weather because Mary and Joseph were traveling. They were going somewhere. You didn't travel in the winter when the weather was bad. So probably it's more likely that his birthday was in the summer sometime, but we don't know that. So Christians very early on took the opportunity to take the religious celebration of others, the celebration of the winter solstice, and kind of just morphed it into, well, we're going to take this big party that you guys already have, and we're going to make it into a Christian holiday, and we're going to call this Christmas, and it's going to be the arrival of Christ. Okay, so once again, there's nothing religiously significant about the 25th of December, except that this is when the Christian church decided that we were going to celebrate the arrival of Christ into the world. So we have Christmas. And for the 4 weeks prior to that, we begin to prepare ourselves for Christ's arrival, for his advent into the world. And we call this season Advent. Now, it was originally 40 days. And you might say to yourself right now, well, what other church season do we have that's 40 days where we're anticipating something happening? And that, of course, would be Lent, where we are preparing ourselves for the Easter season. And indeed, the beginning of Advent was modeled off of Lent. So these two periods of time in our church calendar are actually sort of related. You're kind of doing the same thing. You're sort of preparing yourself for something special that is going to happen. At Easter, obviously, that something special is Christ's death and resurrection. And at Christmas, that something special is the arrival of Christ into the world. So we spend the 4 Sundays prior to the Christmas week preparing for that arrival. So that's what the word Advent means. The other places we use that in English is to talk about, like when something shows up, the advent of this or that. Or sometimes we go on an adventure, which is some sort of neat thing that we're sort of anticipating happening. But that's where that word comes from. Okay. Typically, the church color in the Lutheran Church, our church color in Advent is blue. Blue is associated with hope. It's also associated with truth and integrity, some of these other things you guys might hear in the news, them talking about the thin blue line, talking about police officers. There's a reason why police officers wear blue uniforms. There's this idea of truth and integrity. But it's also a color that symbolizes hope. And of course, we are in anxious hope and awaiting the arrival of Christ. And so that is why you see the altar decked out in blue, and Pastor Sean's garments, a lot will have blue trim, and that is the reason for those colors. Now, the other most visible thing that you'll see in the, excuse me, I'm going to get a drink of water here. Better. Okay. The other thing that you see in the church services is the Advent wreath. So let's spend a minute talking about that. The wreath is round. Round symbolizes eternity, right? So here's, Christ coming into the world and bringing, basically eternity with him, and that eternal relationship of us and Jesus. And then there are 4 candles in the Advent wreath, and they can be different colors, sort of based on which church denomination that you are. They can be blue, can be purple. Typically, I would say, typically, there's 3 purple and 1 pink candles. So the 1 pink candle is always lit on the 3rd Sunday, and that one represents joy or praise, and that's why it's different colors than the other 3. But each candle represents a, a part of this sort of waiting for the arrival of Christ. And you'll notice in the church services that we have a little reading, and then typically we'll have a family light whichever candles it is for that week, 1 through 4. And then there's a reading associated with each candle. And so again, this is just the candles symbolize the light of Christ coming into a dark world. And you guys know all throughout our church year and all throughout the calendar, there's a lot of symbolism of light and darkness. And Christ is almost always symbolized by a light or a candlelight or a flame coming into a dark world. And so in this Christmas season, we're focused on Christ coming into the world, bringing his light of eternal life into the world. We show that physically in the church service with this round, sort of eternal, if you will, wreath with the 4 candles in it representing Christ's light. And as we continue to light each of the candles, we're getting closer and closer and closer to his arrival here on earth. Okay, so just a few words about the Advent season and how we celebrate that in the church. So the final lesson in this unit on other faiths, we've spent the first 2 lessons talking about how we as Lutherans relate to people who have different faiths or worship a different God. And what should our attitude be towards them? How should we act towards them? And remember, we said we had sort of, there's basically 2 ways to attack this. I don't have my whiteboard like I normally have in the classroom. I have my soccer coach's, whiteboard that I draw plays on. But you can either be sort of only my way or everyone is right. So here's kind of the 2 extremes, right? You can be, I don't know if this probably shows up in the camera backwards, but anyway, you can be only I am right and no one else is right, and therefore I will not associate or talk to or say anything nice about anybody else that doesn't believe exactly the same thing I believe. Or on the other side of that spectrum, you can say, well, it really doesn't matter. However people want to relate to God, everything that everybody thinks is, okay for them, so that should be fine. Neither of these 2 extremes are the correct way to approach it, right? I mean, this basically shuts out most of the world from us. And if this one was correct, if everything that everybody believed was right, then why on earth do we have a confirmation class? And why am I busy trying to teach you all of this stuff if it doesn't matter, right? So we as Lutherans certainly believe it matters and believe that our relationship with Jesus is something that is special and correct, and it matters that we believe that way. But the point is that it is okay for us to hold our own beliefs, but yet interact in a respectful manner with people who hold other beliefs, right? And as you'll recall from a previous tape, the story I used to illustrate that was the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, where he met someone who practiced a different religion than he did, but rather than sort of attack her over religious specifics like, well, you guys can't worship here, you have to worship in Jerusalem, he didn't do that. He met her where she was and just encouraged her to have a right relationship with God. And I think in that interaction, there's a model for all of us. Okay, so this week's question, we closed the unit out with a question called, why are there so many different Christian churches? So, in other words, we've spent some time talking about why there are different religions, different approaches to a relationship with God, but now we're talking about just the Christian church. And within the Christian church, there are literally thousands of different churches, we call them denominations, like the denominator in a math problem, right? We call them denominations. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of denominations. And the question this week is, why is that? And the answer is that from the very beginning, as the church was trying to figure out what their message was and what their beliefs were, there has always been disagreement. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just it's a part of the life of the church. So we've got a couple verses to look at here. And again, this is the part of the lesson where you need to go get a Bible if you don't have one. And I'm going to take a drink of water while you're going and getting a Bible. All right. The first verse to look at is Acts chapter 2. We've actually have looked at this before. You'll recognize it when we get there if you've watched some of the other videos. I'm going to go to Acts chapter 2, verses 43 and 47. So this is literally days after Jesus returned to heaven. This is the very first believers, the very first church. And they don't have a church building, and they don't have Bibles, and they don't have hymnals, and they don't have pastors, and they don't have any of this other stuff. They just have the apostles and their stories about things Jesus said and themselves. That's it. They're trying to figure it out. And this is Acts chapter 2, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, fifth book of the New Testament, chapter 2, starting at verse 43. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to anyone as they had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all people. And the Lord added to their numbers daily those who were being saved. Well, that certainly sounds nice, right? Everybody's together. They're sharing everything. They're spending time in church. They're eating together. It didn't last, right? And so immediately disagreements broke out in the early church. And there were more than one, but one of the biggest disagreements was over whether or not you had to be a Jew in order to then be a Christian. Remember, Jesus and all the disciples were all Jews. So the early church thought, well, first of all, you've got to have become a Jew if you're not already. And then once you're Jewish, then you can sort of join this new branch of Judaism called the Way, or the disciples of Christ, or Christians, as they were coming to be called. And then there were those who said, well, no, Christ's message, the gospel, is for everyone. And so the early church really argued about this. And the leaders of the two factions were, can you guess, right? Who's the guy with the biggest mouth in the New Testament, right? It's Peter. And I tell you guys, about 65% of the time, Peter picks the wrong answer. When he's not always wrong. He's just wrong more than half the time. So Peter's actually on the wrong side of history again. Peter is the leader of the folks who think that you must become a Jew in order to then experience the gospel and become a believer in Christ. Leading the other side, the Gentiles, people who believe that anyone can partake of the gospel of Christ, is Paul. Paul, who comes to the scene late, right? And we don't really have time for me to get into the whole story, but Paul is not one of the original apostles. Okay? Paul comes along later, so he's kind of a newcomer. So Peter and the rest of the apostles are sort of looking at Paul like, you weren't there for the whole thing, we were. So we're not sure what we think about your interpretation of this. So if you look, and let's flip over to Galatians. Now, Paul is just not willing to give any ground on this. He doesn't think that Christ's message and the gospel is just for Jews. He thinks it's for everyone that believes in Christ. and he's not going to give any ground. So if we go to Galatians, so I need to go forward in the New Testament. We're in Acts, right? So Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians. So you got to go forward 4 books in the New Testament. Now, Galatians is sometimes called the Magna Carta or the Bill of Rights of Christianity. Galatians is the book where Paul sets out that Christianity is not a subset of Judaism. It's not like, you're Jewish and then we have this sort of little group over here that believes in Jesus. Paul's like, that is not what's going on. Jesus' message is for the whole world. And we're breaking with Judaism and we're breaking with all of these Jewish traditions, and you don't have to be Jewish. You just have to believe in Jesus. And that's what Paul lays out in the book of Galatians. So if you go to chapter 2, Galatians chapter 2, and take a minute if you need to and find it. I'm starting at verse 11, and here what I'm sort of taking a long time to tell this story, but I'm trying to make a point. I want you to see that even amongst the very first disciples and apostles, there was differences of opinion on how to approach Christ's message. All right, so Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. Paul, a lot of times, is very, very straightforward in his writing. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but then when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group, the people who thought you had to be Jewish, right? The other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so it was by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. Barnabas was a friend of Paul's. And Paul's, mad right now at Barnabas because, Peter has kind of won him over. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? Blah, blah, blah. And they go on. Now, it probably shouldn't surprise you to know that they eventually make up their minds that, well, yes, everyone can be saved. And you do not have to be a Jew in order to be part of the Christian community and to be a part of the gospel of Christ. But it takes people like Paul to get them there. All right, so if this is happening very, very soon after Jesus' ministry on earth, and Galatians is one of the oldest books in the New Testament, so that we're talking, maybe 30, 40 years between Jesus' ministry and when Galatians is written. It is one of the oldest pieces of literature that we've got. So this is as close to Jesus as you can get, and they're fighting about what their religion ought to look like. So it's only gotten worse in the last 2,000 years. Okay? The Christian faith has continued to sort of splinter into different groups that believe different things and are led by different people. There's a couple of big ones that you will learn about in school because they're part of Western civilization. The first one happens in the year 1000, and we call it the Great Schism. Schism is just breaking something apart. And the Great Schism is when the Eastern Orthodox Church leaves and forms its own thing, and we're left with the Roman Catholic Church in the sort of Western Europe, with the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Okay, so that happens in AD 1000, AD 1000, not AD 1000. And you'll learn about that in school. And then the next thing that happens is something that we talk about as Lutherans a lot, and that is the Reformation of the Catholic Church, which happens right around 1500. And again, you'll talk about this in school. We talk about it a lot as Lutherans because the Reformation was led by a lot of people, but one of the biggest figures in the Reformation is, of course, Martin Luther, the guy whose teachings we follow in our church. And so that he became sort of the biggest and most well-known name of the so-called Protestants, or the people who protest against the Catholic Church. And so you get this splitting up of the Christian church between Catholic and Protestant in Western Europe. Is everybody following me? You're going to do this in world history when you're in middle school. All right, but you've got the Great Schism splits the Catholic Church off, and then 500 years later, the Reformation splits the Western European Church into the Catholic Church and the Protestants, and that's kind of where we are ever since. So the Catholic Church is kind of one thing, and then there are lots and lots and lots and lots of Protestant denominations. Why is that? Well, it depends upon how they approach the gospel and they approach the message of Jesus. And this is another thing that we talk about a lot in class. The seventh graders maybe have heard me talk about this. I know the sixth graders haven't, so I'm going to take a minute. And usually what I do when I'm teaching this lesson is I sort of draw a fulcrum. So if my marker's running out, I need a marker. Marker. Now, I draw a fulcrum. A fulcrum looks something like that, right? And again, we have these sort of two extremes, just like when I talked a few minutes ago about the two extremes of how we approach other religions. We've got two extremes of how you can approach Christianity, and one is free will. I'm going to explain this. And one is predetermination. So here's the basic question in Christianity, right? Did God create all of us to be able to make our own decisions and basically whether or not we're saved is entirely up to us and whether or not we choose to follow Jesus. And if we don't, then we're not Christians. But if we do, we get to be Christians. But it's all our choice. And over here on the other side is predetermination, means nope, God has figured it all out ahead of time, and you're either part of the elect or you're not. And there's really nothing that man's actions can do about any of this because it is entirely something that God has already ordained before time even began. God had it all figured out. Okay, and then I always ask you guys in class, I say, well, which one of these is right? And it's a trick question because they're both right. Right? This is what we call a paradox. This is both of these things are correct. God has created us with free will and the ability to make decisions, but yet at the same time, the Bible is very clear that God has set out a path for us in our lives, and that ultimately it is the Holy Spirit that guides us to a relationship with God and not anything that we do ourselves. So what do we do? Well, what church you go to has an awful lot to do with where it sits on this teeter-totter. And again, I'm going to make some generalizations here. So here's a generalization. In general, churches that baptize or dunk in the water adults tend to live over here because they are more concerned with the choices that men and women make, right? You make a choice to accept Jesus Christ into your heart and to become a Christian, and at that moment you are saved, but it is a choice that you made, and we're going to show that by then taking that person who had to be old enough to make that choice, and we're going to baptize them. In general, churches that baptize babies tend to be over on this side of the fulcrum, right? So the emphasis isn't, it's not that we don't have choices, we do. Otherwise, confirmation class would be really sort of a dumb waste of time if we didn't think that you, as 12 and 13-year-olds, ought to have some sort of choice about what you believe. But we baptize babies because we believe in general is really more about what God does for us, not really what we do for God. We tend to emphasize God's actions. Folks over here tend to emphasize man's actions. Over here are denominations like, for instance, the Baptist Church. Over here tends to be the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, the Episcopal Church. Methodists are more sort of this way somewhere, and so on and so forth, right? And we could do a whole lesson listing a lot of these major denominations and talking about where they sit on this chart and why, but this is the sort of the quick way of thinking about it, all right? Is it necessarily a bad thing? No. The Bible tells us that God likes diversity. He likes a number of different ideas and ways of approaching things. And it's not necessarily that one denomination is right or wrong, it's just different ways of approaching our Christian faith. And so that is kind of the answer to our question of why are there so many Christian denominations? And again, the point of this whole unit is that we shouldn't go around denouncing people who don't believe exactly the same thing that we believe. We should be respectful of other people's beliefs. We certainly in the Lutheran tradition think that what we believe and what I teach you guys is correct, or we wouldn't teach it. But we're also open to, particularly within the Christian faith, other denominations' approaches and beliefs to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Okay, I think we have one more Bible verse that guide tells me to look up. Okay, we're supposed to look up John chapter 17, verse 20. So we're going to go backwards in the New Testament. John is the fourth book of the New Testament. So we're in Galatians. We left off in Galatians was the last time I had you in the Bible. So go backwards to John. John chapter 17, verse 20. So this is Jesus talking. And Jesus says in verse 20, chapter 17, verse 20, my prayer is not for them alone. I pray also, he's talking about his disciples. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you've sent me. Christians believe that we are all one in the body of Christ, even though we have different approaches to our church services and to some of the things that we believe about Christianity. In the end, what we believe in is Jesus, right? And that unites us and makes us one all throughout the Christian church. Okay, so that's the end of this lesson. This is also the end of the unit on other beliefs, and it's the end of the instruction for the fall semester. So until we next have an opportunity to get together and continue with our confirmation lessons, I wish everyone a fantastic and happy and healthy and safe Christmas season and Christmas break and New Year's. And I look forward to getting back in touch with you guys as we get a little closer to being able to do some in-person lessons and continuing the confirmation class. Thanks. Bye-bye now.